Welcome to the Winners Win podcast, where we highlight awesome people in Kansas City and their secrets to success. I'm your host, Jaime Simpson. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Net Standard. At Net Standard, we manage technology so you can manage your business. Today, my guest is Shane Talbot, my friend and cybersecurity expert. Hi, Shane.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks for driving downtown to join me today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, why don't you take a minute to kind of introduce yourself? So, who you are and what you do that's interesting and, sort of how we got here.
Sure. Well, I'd say that I'm a Kansas City native for the most part. Not 100%, but close enough, I think. And I've been in the world of IT and security for quite some time. Started off way back in the pre-2000 era as a software developer, and then kind of hit most of the major areas along the way. Systems engineering, Windows and Linux, network administration, network engineering, all kinds of different things. I was definitely really enthusiastic about security since being a very young man. And kind of more formally moved into that when I was in the Navy. Then after getting out of the Navy, I've been, I guess, pretty much wholly dedicated to security operations or IT operations in some way, shape, or form. Usually in the MSP, MSSP space. And more recently, I've started teaching as well. So I teach cybersecurity boot camps through an organization, EDX, and they partner with universities all around the country. So I've taught cohorts for University of Kansas, WashU in St. Louis, UNC Charlotte, etc. So it's a little bit about me.
Well, that's perfect. Yeah. And part of the reason that I asked you to join me is so we can talk a little bit about cybersecurity, because it's a question I get asked about a lot. And you're a much more you've got a lot better street cred in that conversation than I do. So we'll get into that. But before we do that, why don't you answer a question I ask most people, which is, we're here to talk about how successful you are, but I think it's great for everyone to hear or think through an example of something that was a memorable or significant loss. So as opposed to a win, a time when maybe you lost a game or something in your life happened where it was sort of a significant or memorable not success.
Wow, significant or memorable.
And it can be anything from like, hey, I was in Little League and this was a bummer, to like, we've had several people that have talked about starting businesses that failed, or I don't know, there's all sorts of different, the world is your oyster. Whatever you want is your option.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, to be self-effacing here for a moment, I think when I was a very young man, I went off to college when I was 17 years old, which was probably, a recipe for disaster in and of itself. But I definitely struggled my first 2 years of college, and not necessarily academically per se, but I just didn't have any idea what I wanted to do, right? I think I went through 4 or 5 degrees, switching my major 4 or 5 times, and in roughly 2 years, bounced around between different schools, really just couldn't make up my mind. Strangely enough, I think the only thing that sort of carried me during that period was Japanese, since I took Japanese for all through high school. So I was as a freshman, 17-year-old freshman, I was taking 500 level Japanese courses, which was very unusual. But
it's unusual.
It is. But yeah, that was a little rough, and after a while, I was like, you know what, I'm definitely racking up a pretty significant student loan bill here, so maybe I should just chill for a moment. So that's kind of what I did. I stepped away from it for a little bit, and then it wasn't until a little bit later when I joined the military that I was like, okay, well, that's actually why I joined the military. I decided that it was time for Uncle Sam to help out a bit. I do my part. He does his part. We all win in the end. And so once I joined the military, then I kind of was able to then focus on narrowing on what I wanted to do, and kind of hit the ground running. But yeah, there was definitely, I'd say, a pretty significant amount of time and money wasted in those early years of post-secondary education.
Well, as a mother of college students, I can appreciate the comment because it is, I do think it's tough. I think it's tough to figure out, who you are and what you want to do for the rest of your life when you're 17 and
Absolutely.
have seen very little outside of the school, so
Yeah,
I
but
can certainly appreciate that.
as frustrating as it is looking back, kind of as you mentioned, I think it's going to be a very, very valuable experience and perspective to have when it's time for my own children to go to college, right? So I think it's a win in the end.
Let's hope. I mean, in my experience, they always surprise you with some version of whatever that you're not expecting.
That's
like,
true.
I hadn't thought about this as an option. Like, I didn't know you'd want to go be a cruise line dancer or whatever it is. It's on the list.
I feel like I already know which kid will be the one that throws me the curveball, but yeah.
As long as you've got it pre-identified, that will help you out. That will help you out. So, you and I met because we have worked together in the past, and you have built. In fact, I think one of my first memories of you is when you built out the SOC for Alexander Open Systems at the time. And so, talk a little bit. I think cybersecurity is kind of this big, beefy, nerdy. I mean, super nerdy topic, right? And I do not want to get into the realm of super nerdness, but I think if you think about from a business people perspective, how would you describe, sort of your approach to building out that service that really we didn't have before, and how'd you kind of break that down, and how does that affect what you do now in terms of teaching cybersecurity, and maybe frame it up that way?
Sure. I think that one of the most significant things that gets lost in the shuffle in any conversation around cybersecurity is practicality, right? And it's an easy thing to have kind of fall off by the wayside, because there's you've got all these different horror stories that circulate in the media, and then you pair that up with all these different solutions out there that each one is marketed as the sort of silver bullet. When you combine these two things, people tend to get a little lost in the sauce and kind of forget what cybersecurity is really supposed to be about at the end of the day. And what that is basically risk management, right? I mean, all cybersecurity is basically your risk management efforts, right?
I can't help it. I just have to laugh about it because I just think people need to know that this is the sage, mature version of Shane Talbot, because young Shane Talbot and I spent a lot of time negotiating risk, right? So
it's true.
Young Shane Talbot would walk in and go, "We've got to do these things. I can't believe we're not doing these things, whatever." And I'd be like, "Well, do we have to do those things?" And so I'm so enjoying
there's some truth to what you say. However, I would push back slightly and say that one of the things that I always pushed for above and beyond everything else was, we needed to conduct proper risk assessments, right? You can't really determine what course of action is necessary without quantifying or attempting to quantify your risk, right? So, going back to, building SOCs and designing managed security services and things like that, SOC as a service and yada, yada, yada. I think that it's very easy to sell something or offer something that people ultimately don't need or they don't understand how to use correctly, right? I've always said that, a given organization can probably get they can probably check most of their security boxes by just improving their processes.
Yeah.
Right? Looking at, people, process, and partners, right? To kind of throw back to ITIL there. Look at what you can do there, right? First and foremost, before you start throwing a lot of money at technology and technical services and things like that. Because the reality of the situation is, if you look at high profile breaches and things like that, most of them are a failure of process, right, before any sort of significant failure of technology. Now, of course, technology is what enables people to make the most of that process failure, right? Attackers or whatnot. But and even that right there is an example of how people kind of lose sight of what matters in security. We tend to get overly obsessed with the notion of you know nefarious actors and things like that, and forget that when you in your efforts to sort of preserve the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information and systems, negligence and accidents and just plain silly behavior is often just as much of a threat as any would be bad guy, right?
So to help out the non-technical person, I mean, give an example of that. Like, what's an example of a process breakdown versus a technology breakdown?
So just well, first and foremost, here's a great example, right? BYOD environments are a great example of
Bring your own device.
Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
bring your own device. Any sort of environment, and it's funny too, because nowadays I think most organizations are BYOD in some sense.
Well, at least startups tend to be, right? And most companies, I think where you're going is most companies allow you to bring your own tablet, phone,
Sure.
whatever into the
At
network,
a
right?
minimum, at an
Yeah.
absolute
Right.
minimum, most people have some sort of connection to their employer's systems via their cell phone,
Sure.
right? Whether it's just email or whatever is the messaging platform, Teams or Slack or whatever. There's usually at least that connection point,
Right.
right? And that right off the bat creates an exposure, that creates a risk, right? And it's an interesting thing because how exactly do you address that, right? Is the answer an expensive MDM solution, a mobile device management solution, where you're basically imposing security on these people's personal devices? Or is the answer get them additional devices? Then you've got people running around with the work phone and the personal phone.
Neither of which is a very popular option
Right,
from an
right,
employee
right.
perspective, right?
So in terms of process, like how do you deal with a situation like that from a process perspective? I think you have to kind of go back to the drawing board and think about where do you store certain information and where does certain communication occur and things like that. And if you start reshaping that and you start reconsidering that, then maybe you can create a situation where having personal devices in the organization is not necessarily that big of a deal because those devices can't access information that would be considered high risk, right?
Yeah. We
So-
talk a lot about, I mean, I think when I talk to a business about exposure and risk, I always, to me, one of the very first things you have to do is identify what data you really care about, right?
Sure.
And
Yep.
because the more you limit that scope, right, or so to speak, then the easier it gets to protect it, right? If your finance system is the system that you don't want public to the world, well then pull the finance system off, limit the number of people who can get to it, and make sure they can't get to it outside of the network would do a lot of favors for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's where I think budgets and things can get really inflated is when you're trying to bring all things from all people is too much. You have to be able to kind of break down those things and think, how can I make smarter decisions about and really spend the money to protect the things I actually care about and then not worry maybe quite so much
Yeah,
about some of those other
absolutely.
things.
And that again is going back to what I was discussing earlier. When you've got these security service providers or these sort of point solution sellers and whatnot in your face constantly promoting what it is they have to offer, it can be easy to feel like you need to secure all the things, and you've never taken the time to do exactly what you're talking about, which is identify what is the priority, right? What are the crown jewels? What data actually needs to be protected, what processes need to be protected, right? And once you actually put forth the time and the effort to figure that out, you might realize that, okay, this significantly narrows the scope of my efforts, right? I mean, classic example is, people will often spend, exuberant amounts of money on next generation firewall to protect some environment that may not necessarily need that level of protection, but then they'll kind of ignore something like, like we were just discussing, the ability for employees to use like cloud storage, for example, could be a huge risk. And all you need to do is turn that off. It doesn't require an expensive solution to deal with that potential exposure, right?
Yeah.
I mean, generally speaking, like access control policies and things like that, there's always significant room for improvement in the systems that you already have in place without you having to go outside that to purchase additional security controls.
So we started talking about how people are one of the bigger threats. And I think the phrase you used was something about how to not control, I don't think was the word you used, but protect secure the humans. Yes. So talk more about that and what you mean.
Sure. So, I guess human beings will always be the ultimate wild card in the equation, right? In any conversation about risk or security. And it is a very, very difficult thing to deal with. And I think probably one of the first and foremost challenges in security, because you can throw all sorts of money at technical solutions to try to wrap controls around people to prevent them from doing this or that. But at the end of the day, that's only going to get you so far, right?
Yeah.
And I think, what it really boils down to is, security education, security awareness, it really just isn't where it needs to be. And I think there's an underinvestment in those things out there in the world. But that's tricky because how should that look, right? What sort of security awareness training is actually effective at the end of the day? What sort of level of security education should we consider table stakes now, right? That's a very, very difficult thing to pin down. I think that where a lot of this sort of training and education falls down is it just really isn't engaging enough, or there isn't really the incentive for employees to care, right? I mean, I think we've all seen the annual mandatory security training that is just, click, yep. I mean, even as a security professional, sometimes I will just completely zone out when going through those, right? Because they're just not engaging enough, right? You need to figure out how to get people to care, and that's very challenging, right? That's very tricky, but it's hugely important, right? Because your human beings are going to be your first and last line of defense, right? And they're often, unfortunately, going to be your ultimate exposure as well. Right?
Well, and I think it's harder than it used to be, right? Because I think attackers are getting smarter. Like they're more mature. It's no longer like the king of Zimbabwe asking for money for, whatever. It's like, I mean, they tend to look much more authentic, and it's harder to spot some of those attacks. And I think that's why, the nuance of it takes time. And I tell business people all the time, I think the real problem is not so much that your employees don't care, it's that they're not paying attention. And it's almost always a busy person that's the problem, not somebody who doesn't care. I think one of the stories that I always think about when we talk about cybersecurity in the office is, I've always worked in technology, and I think we're the worst, right? It's like doctors are their own, have the worst health because they don't pay attention to what they tell everybody else to do. And I think we all sit there and think we know all the things. And my favorite was that time, and I'm pretty sure you were there, but my favorite was the time when we did a phishing test at one of the businesses we worked with. And I think we sent out something about a secret admirer. Do you remember that?
I tell this story to my class.
I know, I love this story. And, it was like, and you probably sent it, so you probably remember what it said better than I. I just remember that, it's this IT office. There's like 3 women in the entire office, 2 of whom are grandma aged. And sure enough, we sent out something that says, click here to figure out your secret admirer. And it was the most senior network engineer clicked the link.
Senior network architect.
It was like, and I'm thinking, who do you think your secret admirer is? There's like 2 women here. But it was so funny, and it was my favorite. And I think about that all the time because it's not that he didn't know better. It's just that we either got him with the right hook or on a bad moment or whatever.
Yeah.
But it was just such a perfect example of it. It's not because you're so smart that you don't know better,
Yeah,
right?
that guy was even a CISSP.
Yes, he was, which is like the ultimate security certification.
Right,
For those
right.
of you who are not living and breathing this every day.
Yeah, which is but that's exactly, that's exactly my point, right? Human beings will always be at risk, no matter who they are, no matter where they are. And the other thing too to consider is that it isn't necessarily always about, human beings falling for phishing attacks or social engineering of some kind. Humans make mistakes too.
Sure.
Humans can be just negligent in their behavior, and these things can often be just as damaging as an attacker compromising a human being and then leveraging that to accomplish whatever their goal is. You see things all the time where a person just makes a mistake, or a brief little fit of laziness or whatnot, and you have to factor that in anytime you're considering what is possible, right? You have to factor in that humans are very unpredictable. My wife is a software developer, and I tease her all the time about how software developers, the first thing that gets thrown out the window is security, because they just want to get the code to work.
Yeah, right.
Right?
And then we'll secure it later.
Exactly.
Right.
So you need to sort of go into situations just assuming that that's going to be the case, right?
So you are spending a lot of time teaching the next generation of security professionals. So what is it that what are you teaching them now that's going to influence how we all do this 5 years from now?
I think one of the things that I really focus on, so obviously the program that I teach it's extremely technical, very, very hands-on. It's a boot camp style. So it's 6 months long, 3 nights a week, no breaks, nothing. A very, very, very robust program. And we cover everything under the sun from, just basic, Linux and Windows hardening, all the way to, pen testing, security operations, cloud security, microservices security, digital forensics, everything. We cover the whole gamut, right? So we're teaching people to be very, very technical and to look at things through a very, very technical lens. So that creates a certain level of danger as you put these people out into the workforce, because now you've got the situation where I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So I always try to make sure that I zoom out and explain to my students how to look at this from the business perspective, right? Here's the technical solution, but you need to stop for a moment and think about whether this technical solution is even warranted given the situation. The other thing that I'm also trying to prepare them for is, and I know this pain firsthand, being in leadership in security, sometimes you are making decisions, about priorities or whatnot, right? Which direction your efforts should go, that are being dictated by the needs and constraints of the business. And the technical people underneath you do not necessarily always agree with those decisions, because again, they're focused too heavily on what is the technical solution to the problem, right? I see this, I know the technical answer, why are we not doing this? Well, because there was a business decision made to deprioritize that, right? And if you have that sort of friction between security leadership and the security, engineers and analysts and whatnot, it's not going to help you in the long run. So I'm trying to make sure that I educate my students on how to take a step back and try to look at the big picture and try to be aware of the how and the why of that top-down decision making that is ultimately determining what you do and don't do in terms of your day-to-day actions in security. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think the inverse to that, though, and a lot of businesses we work with haven't haven't gotten to this level yet. But it's that same struggle. we fought together in the past, where your senior most executives, your C-level executives, really have got to have some awareness of the security risks. And without that, if there's too many layers between those guys who are saying, hey, here's the problem I see and how are we going to fix it, if there's too many layers there, a lot of times your executives, because they're not technical and they're not interested in spending $2 million to protect a cybersecurity, and they're thinking about different things. And so you've got to have somebody. I mean, I think the truly special skill is somebody who can translate from, hey, here's the risks and here's why they're risks and here's sort of what we recommend to do about them, but that's got to be understood by a C-level executive. You've got to know, even if you choose to accept it, right? Which is completely annoying for security professionals too, but you at least have to get to the point where you feel like you're heard, and executives have to be at a level where they understand this is the risk that we have. So in not doing anything, this is where we're sitting. We're accepting this,
Sure.
or we're intentional, like you said, prioritizing this over that, or that's a next year thing, or we're going to make this decision over here. And if you don't have good visibility to that and your C-levels aren't paying attention to that, then you're sitting in a real high risk situation. And from an executive perspective, that's a problem. You can't outsource that risk. At the end of the day, the CEO or the owner is going to be the one sitting in front of the shareholders or private equity or the media if they're publicly held and saying, okay, yeah, we knew we had this situation and here's how we chose to handle it. I mean, in the end, it comes down to your ability to understand that risk. And so I think that's got to change in the next few years too, is that it's not enough to go, okay, well, I've got those IT guys and they're sort of doing what they're doing, but you don't really understand what position that's putting you in and the choices that you're making.
So. Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I'd like to think that I'm doing my best to train the sort of next generation of ambassadors, if you will, right? People that have the technical understanding, the technical know-how, but they are going into a situation, at least attempting to look at it from that C-level, purely business perspective, so they can kind of understand where those folks are coming from in their decision making and what they might not understand or what they might not be aware of, and then trying to teach them how to effectively communicate to these people and also receive the communication from those people and translate that back down into your security actions. Because if you have that good, smooth two-way communication, that's going to be a significant boon to the overall effectiveness of your risk management efforts. But like you said, if that communication isn't really working in both those directions, then you're going to have some pretty significant breakdowns that are going to ultimately significantly increase your risk, right? So
you've taken a pretty significant sort of pivot in your career where you're not really doing day-to-day security other than your teaching, right? So how has all of that led you to what you're doing now?
It's a good question. So right now, I sort of represent solutions that are a little bit more centered around IT operations management, visibility, health, right? That sort of thing. But it's all very, AI and ML is really where everything is trying to move right now. And first and foremost, IT operations and security operations are very much tied at the hip. I explain this to people all the time, right? So even though if I might be a little bit more focused on IT operations right now, there are security implications for every single thing that happens in IT operations.
Very much so.
I never really feel like I'm very far away from it.
Yeah.
Right. And I do firmly believe, to tell a very brief story here. So back when I first, started, building SOCs and getting involved with technologies like SIM and SOAR and things like that, I identified right off the bat the need for artificial intelligence and machine learning to really do what human beings couldn't do, right? And I got very excited about it. I even had some GI Bill sitting around, so I decided to go get a master's in data analytics so I could get exposure to all these things and learn about these things. And I thought, well, if I can bring that back to, the world of security, imagine all the things that we could do. Well, I learned very quickly, and this was many years ago. I learned very quickly that unfortunately the technology just wasn't there yet.
Right.
Right. AI and ML was just not there yet. Now, fast forward to today. Now I'm seeing a lot of IT operations and security operations sort of solutions that are very, very AI and ML focused, and it's becoming very effective, right? And I firmly believe in the need for these things, and I believe in what they can do, right, for an organization. So that's why I am where I am right now. I'm kind of, standing behind things that I actually believe in terms of their ability to transform an organization and really help with that risk management at the end of the day. I think so. To kind of sum it up, if you can vastly improve your visibility, if you can vastly improve your operations, if you can vastly improve those workflows and really create that true like force multiplying effect where you can accomplish more with fewer human beings, I think that has significant benefits to the organization and especially security, right? Because that's one of the biggest drivers for a lot of the security problems we have is that there just aren't enough people to do what needs to be done. Yeah. And when you talk about that, you don't have enough people to really do what needs to be done in IT operations as well, then this is a problem that just compounds, right? So, yeah, so I kind of, I live in both worlds, I guess, and I see their fates as intrinsically intertwined, so.
I think that's true. So,
yep.
Well, we're about out of time. So what I like to ask is, in your career and all of the different changes you've made and sort of the things you've seen, how would you boil that all down to a piece of advice? Maybe for your kids or for somebody who's looking for a career in technology, what have you learned in your successes?
Sure. I'd say if I were to boil it down to a piece of advice, I would say, never stop learning and never stop, branching out and really kind of pursuing new paths and new perspectives, I guess, more importantly. And when I say never stop learning, I'm not really saying like, okay, you've just got that certification, now go study this technology and get that certification. I mean, sure, that's definitely important to an extent for certain people, but there's this world of technology just continues to grow and expand, and I think people can get very kind of stuck in their lane and fail to consider or stay aware of everything that's moving and shifting around them. And I do think that there is at this point, there's a need to really branch out farther and farther and stay aware of more and more things. And if you don't do that, you're going to start to fall dangerously behind. And I think especially at the C level, at the executive level, unfortunately, you can't afford to be oblivious to what's happening anymore. And the notion of a non-technical executive it's getting more and more difficult to accommodate, right? So you're going to have to branch out. You're going to have to stay aware of what's happening and really just make sure that you're learning everything that you can, right?
Yeah. Well, you're certainly a lifelong learner, so that's a good piece of advice to sum up what you've done with yourself. So, well, thanks for being here today. I appreciate it, Shane.
Thanks for having me.